our webinar, Adapting to Tomorrow, Climate Change and India's Workforce, organized as a part of our project Good and Better Jobs in India. I'm delighted to see such a diverse and enthusiastic audience joining us today. As we stand at the brink of a new era with the aim of attaining net zero emissions, addressing climate change and its impact on the workforce is really crucial for ensuring sustainable economic growth and protecting vulnerable communities. We are fortunate enough to have with us a panel of esteemed speakers who will share their insights and perspectives on this critical issue. The panel will be moderated by Dr. Pradipta Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh is a distinguished fellow at TERI and CUTS, researching on the interface of science, economics, philosophy, and public policy. A former IAS officer, he retired as secretary to the Ministry of Environment and Forest and has served as economic advisor to the PM and senior environment specialist at the Asian Development Bank. With a PhD in economics and public policy analysis from Carnegie Mellon University and a BTech in chemical engineering from IIT Delhi, he received notable accolades, including the BP Pal Centenary Award for Environmental Sustainability and Alumni Achievement Awards from both his alma maters. Today we have with us as panelist Dr. Saudamini Zutshi, who is the Partnerships Manager at Purpose India, leading efforts to build and manage stakeholder relationships across various programs and movements. With over 10 years of experience in the development sector, Saudamini has been actively involved in grassroots movements and international NGOs focusing on WASH, child rights, and media literacy. Dr. Kiran Somvanshi, a seasoned business analyst and journalist with a deep understanding of governance, sustainability, gender, CSR, and public policy. With over 17 years of experience at the Economic Times, she has become a trusted voice in the FMCG, pharmaceuticals, and healthcare sectors. Mr. A.B. Chakravarti, co-CEO of Upaya Social Ventures, he is an impact investment professional with over 14 years of experience championing the fight against extreme poverty through scalable business and job creation. His expertise spans various sectors like agriculture, health, and technology for development. And Ms. Neha Kumar, a leading expert in sustainable finance and climate action, currently heading the South Asia program for the Climate Bonds Initiative. Based out of Delhi, she drives efforts to scale up the green bonds market and foster sustainable financial ecosystem in the region. She is also a member of our Grow Jobs Project Advisory Committee. Before we dive into this fruitful session, here is to certain house announcements. Each panelist will be allotted 8+2 minutes for presenting their views on the questions posed to them by the moderator. As our panelists have put forward their views, the floor will be open for discussion, which will include all our participants present with us today. We also request all the panelists and presenters to please keep their videos on so that the discussion becomes much more engaging. We also request only the person who speaks to turn on his or her microphone, and other participants are requested to kindly keep their microphones off when not speaking to avoid any inconvenience. Lastly, participants having questions are requested to either ask the same over chat box or use the raise hand option present in Zoom. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to a stimulating and productive discussion. Over to you, Sanchita ma'am.
Thank you, Tasmita, for the introduction. And welcome, all of you. Welcome to our esteemed panelists. I have interacted with some of you before, and Dr. Ghosh, who is kind enough to moderate our webinar for 2 straight months now. Last month also, we organized a webinar where Dr. Ghosh was the moderator. So these webinars or virtual panel discussions are a series of virtual discussions we've been holding under a project we call Grow Jobs. And that's a short form of a very long name. And this project is being implemented in 2 phases. It started from 2018, and we are almost at the end of the 2nd phase of this project. So the main objective of the project is to talk about alternative models of economic growth by means of bringing discussions on workers' welfare in more mainstream discussions, or rather, bring it more in focus of discussions. And we aim to build a narrative through our work. And so, thus these webinars, through these webinars, we are discussing things, coming up with some ideas, and, also hopefully generating more awareness. And at least, we are coming up with some solutions. We've got some great solutions in our past webinars. Now, in this project, we have not really looked at climate change. And mostly we've been talking about workers which have informal kind of working arrangements. So informal workers, contractual workers, blue collar workers, gig workers. But what we see is that, we need to discuss certain aspects of climate change, at least, particularly say skilling or reskilling. How are you going to prepare your future workforce given, given the impacts of climate change, or to mitigate climate change impacts. But also there are issues such as, workers who are more exposed to elements of nature. As climate change, and then as weather becomes more unpredictable, already, a lot of them suffer. How can, say, public infrastructure or facilities be built to address their issues? So, for example, gig workers who are outside, and already, right now we are conducting a study on gig workers, and we've done some surveys. And a lot of them have spoken about, need to have some shelters, access to drinking water, things like public toilets. And, when we talk about inclement weather, their problems even become worse. So these are some of the things we have found, but we are really, really keen to hear our panelists today. So I will not take more time. I will invite Dr. Ghosh to please begin the discussions and moderate the session. Thank you. Dr. Ghosh.
Thank you, Sanchita. Now, this webinar is on climate change and employment. And by employment, we mean not only the quantum of employment, but also the qualitative aspects of employment, impacts on marginal communities and groups, including women and so on. So it's the, when we talk of employment in this context, we are talking of a much broader theme than just the question of, numbers of jobs. Now, when we look at the employment perspectives ahead over the next several decades, there are two major contemporary issues which potentially impact the qualitative and the quantitative aspects of employment. And these are artificial intelligence and climate change. In each case, there's little hard data to go by. And that's because the scale and direction of economic transformation in either case is still uncertain. However, policymaking cannot wait. We have to prepare for the future, because if we wait, we may be in for nasty surprises. Accordingly, we have to proceed by educated guesswork, noting the nature and extent of uncertainty in our guesses. When we come to the context of climate change, there are at least three dimensions to the question of employment. The first is the nature and extent of job losses and gains in the green economy. Clearly, employment will fall in the fossil fuel-related sectors. For example, coal mining, petroleum extraction, thermal power, integrated steel plants, and so on. An increase in renewables and other clean energy-related sectors. For example, solar and wind power, green hydrogen-based industries, mining and extraction of rare earths, lithium, and nuclear materials, and so on. And here again, there are both quantitative and qualitative aspects. The second are the impacts, which may be positive or negative, of climate change on the natural resource base and on employment based on these. For example, occupations based on natural resources, they would include cropping, fishing, forestry, animal husbandry, and so on. Also, we have the large informal sector, which going forward may not be as large a proportion of the economy as it is now, but still we expect that in the next 2 to 3 decades, vast numbers of people will still continue to be employed in the informal economy. And in these occupations, the effect of the green economy, as well as temperature change on productivity and earnings. Recently, Professor Somanathan of ISI, he has published a paper showing that in the case of informal sector workers in Delhi, there is a marked fall in earnings during the summer when temperatures rise above the seasonal means. The third is that given that technological transformation will be rapid, how does one ensure that the workforce is reskilled? And in some cases, that may be infeasible. And where the workforce cannot be reskilled, the political economy of devising a safety net. So now we are not talking of safety nets to enable workers to transition from one occupation to the other. It is a safety net for premature retirement of the workers. So while one can retrain a young blue or white collar worker for the skilled requirements of the new economy, one cannot do so for many older workers. And setting up these long-term safety nets will involve major political economy questions. So without further ado, let me go to the 4 speakers in today's panel who will address these questions and others. I'm confident that their insights will be deep and thought-provoking. And I hope that we will also have, before we close, an animated discussion with questions and comments from our participants. So I would now like to give the floor to our first speaker, Mr. A.B. Chakravarti. He's already been introduced by Tasmita. So Mr. Chakravarti, you have the floor.
Thanks, Dr. Ghosh. Very good afternoon to everyone. Thanks, Sanchita, Rashmita, and the entire Cuts team. Very happy to be here. I think this is a topic which is very close to our heart, Upaya Social Venture, because the North Star for us is employment generation or job creation for the underserved communities in India through enterprise investing. Because one can think about addressing the climate change through different perspective. Each stakeholder has a role to play. There can be a private sector, there can be a not-for-profit civil society, and there is a government, and then there are other stakeholders like that. Each one has a role to play. The approach that Upaya Social Venture is taking is more a private enterprise investing route. Meaning we identify companies which are early stage startups or for-profit social enterprises, small and medium enterprises, which are developing product or services and which will typically bring employment and create jobs for the underserved communities, which we are now seeing the majority of the employment, what Dr. Ghosh told us, the informal economy, because that's what the majority being in India currently, right? It can vary from agriculture sector where small and marginal farmers are involved, landless laborers are involved, to waste management space, which is not even today in mainstream, where a lot of sanitary workers are involved. The first time they came into the picture is only during the pandemic. Otherwise, a lot of people even don't talk about it. even as an informal sector where there is a workforce behind it and somebody is working, right? Then you have construction, gig workers, and there is a huge artisan base in India, which is the second largest informal economy after agriculture. I think with the tailwinds that from fossil fuel to renewable energy is good, but at the same time, you also need to see what is the climate change can have an impact on the informal sector. How do you bring them into formal workforce? So that becomes a central theme for us. And climate change automatically became our lens because the vulnerability quotient is very, very high because of the community that we work with and the geography that we are working with, right? So it is with that lens we started doing our work. Today, after 13 years, 40 enterprises we have invested, and they went on to create 43,000 jobs in this sector across different subsectors that I touched upon. The great part by design, what we did is more than 50% of the job holders are women, which we feel is more vulnerable and very under-resourced sort of setting, underrepresented. So we want to create more jobs. 50% of the enterprises that we've invested is also sort of women-led, right? So that's the another area that we are working, and 50% is on climate mitigation and adaptation. I'll touch some of this point where I think where I've been asked to speak. So this is the context where I'm going to speak, which is more how do you look at climate change adaptation from an individual, from a private enterprise perspective. Maybe last 2 minutes I'll reserve for the areas that I feel where a not-for-profit, government, legislation, those kind of intervention is required. But majority of my part of the conversation, I'll stick to the private enterprise investing and what some of the private folks can do, right? I think I'll start with a simple example of a company which is based in Barpeta in Assam, company called Tamil Plates. I think this company, this is a IRMA graduate who went there to this place. There's a place in Assam, has heavy vagaries of floods because whenever sort of Brahmaputra during the monsoon it swells, this is the first place that get affected. Leave alone underemployment, there was no employment when this gentleman Arindam started the business, back in 2012-13. If I have to give you a benchmark rate to report what is the daily wages that was looking at that point of time was just INR 50 rupee. Any meaningful employment, and that is not available 365 days. So that is a problem Arindam and his team from Tamil Plate were faced with. Then they said, okay, what can we do about it? Because there is no resource here, right? So they found something very interesting. What has been done in some parts of India, which is how do you use the wasted arecanut leaves to convert that into a dinnerware plate. That's what they started with. Very crude machinery. The women job holder does not know how to use it. The value chain was not established because everybody thought the arecanut, the betel leaves that were falling were waste. So they built the value chain saying that could you collect the waste that was coming out, which is the leaves, which is a very resourceful material. And they started paying for the amount of leaves that were collected. And there is a value chain that they set separately for women job holders where there can be a sorting grading to say which one should go to a grade A, grade B plate making. And then there is a third part of the value chain where somebody was making plates using machines, these are handheld machines, dinnerware plates were made. And the fourth part of the supply chain was packing and then exporting it to different countries, which are premium. So 10 years later, they were able to send the consignment even outside the country, initially which they started as a national. This is a classical example of what an income generating activity can do when you are faced with the climate change, whether you call it adaptation or resilience, right? When you put more money in the hands of the job holders, especially women, the family as a whole sort of benefit is something we were able to see through. Very powerful example in terms of where they are currently standing with zero employment back in 2014 to now. There are 5,000 women job holders. They are associated with the Assam in different parts of the state, and now they are also expanding into the other parts of the northeastern region. So that's so why I said income generation is at the right, center, left is because that's a key important element when you are starting in a most vulnerable geography, because in our view there are other support sectors. Once you have a reliable quantity and quality of income to do, then there can be support mechanisms that can be built. The support mechanism, I think Dr. Ghosh touched upon and Sanchita also touched upon in her talk, which is it could be anything to do with your health or your housing is poor. How do you improve it? Your, let's say, education to the children, things like that. How do you educate? So other infrastructure can grow surrounding if the income mechanisms are well established. I think that's the most vulnerability that at least we found in the aspect of when we are working with the climate change. Just I'll give an example in the same instance when we, at least when job holders told us that they were well settled during one of the most drastic moment in the world and in the country, right, which is pandemic. Because 7-8 years after Tamil Plate was started, pandemic hit. Most of the income generating activity of many of the enterprises were down. But Tamil Plates, because they had orders, they did not stop. The initial 2-3 months, the value chain collection was trouble, but they were able to give.
2 minutes left. You have 2
Sure.
minutes.
Thanks, Ghosh. Yeah. So they were still able to collect and manufacture the plates that they were doing and still earn income, which means that whatever that was coming their way in terms of a distress was completely averted. So that's a classical example of when you hit with the climate disaster, how do you sort of really overcome that? This is just one example of how it is. So similarly, there are other value chains we see as powerful where in post-harvest losses, extreme heat, how do you bring solar dryers into place? In silk value chain, where we saw women were using extremely drudgery activity of something called thigh reeling. Now, can you replace that with renewable energy-based reeling machines? Things like that. The intervention can be end-to-end in agriculture value chains, and the same thing can be done in many other spaces in waste management and so on another sector. So that's on the private side. I think for us, if it is local government and the not-for-profit, also play a very critical role. That's what I'll take maybe a minute to close it. Is also we see equally powerful. We see them as a partner and collaborator in our effort. There are certain things the private sector cannot do, which is, in our view, great resource mobilization, capacity building. We see this as a very powerful tool, which a local not-for-profit government bodies have sort of played. One instance is, how do you take government schemes directly to job holder? That's something I don't think a private player can sort of do. A local not-for-profit civil society understands this, and a local government body is better poised to say, who's the, through vulnerability assessment can tell who it should reach to, right? For which many of our enterprises are collaborating with this kind of partners. With this, I'll pause. So that's sort of my view on how a private sector can play a role in climate adaptation and resilience, and especially for targeting women in particular. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chakravarti, for this wide-ranging presentation on the role of the private sector in addressing the vulnerabilities of the marginalized groups, especially women. Now, our next speaker is Dr. Saudamini Zutshi, and she will be speaking about the unorganized sector and how to safeguard these employees from the dangers of climate change. So, Dr. Zutshi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, and thank you, Dr. Sanchita and Tasmita, for organizing and convening us all. I would like to start with being completely in agreement with Dr. Sanchita when she says that there need to be alternate models of economic growth. Well, the alternate models of economic growth require alternate models of imagination. And that is where purpose as an organization comes in. As a social communications agency, we work, our entry point to work with vulnerable communities is communications and campaigning and public mobilization. So just to give a brief overview of who we are as an organization and how that impacts the work we do or informs the work we do with the unorganized sector. Purpose is a social impact creative agency, and we've been working for the last 15 years. Using storytelling and insight-led campaigns to engage and mobilize communities. By which, what I essentially mean is that we deliver innovative campaign strategies through impact-led and evidence-based campaigning. Some of our work with the informal sector essentially looks to highlight and mainstream the disproportionate impact of air pollution, heat stress, unforeseen climatic conditions on the lives of these vulnerable audiences, and also enable greater access to government measures to build their own resilience. We've largely worked with the informal trucking ecosystem in 7 states of North India. We've worked with brick-kiln owners and brick-kiln workers in Uttar Pradesh in around 35 districts. And we've been, for the last 2 years, doing consultation with urban transport workers in Karnataka, in Delhi and Mumbai around what does sustainable sustainable and just transition of fleet electrification really look like. And through our work, what we found is that there are key challenges and opportunities around the unorganized and informal sectors, which is that the largest challenge that we're facing is that key public audiences that hold political, socio-economic, and cultural power are not being effectively mobilized to express their demands for the unorganized sector and not necessarily on behalf of them, while we capacitate and also mobilize the informal sector workers. And also, the opportunity is that we have identified that there is a lack of coordinated communication and campaigning capacity among networks that can be built in to sort of resolve these challenges. While recognizing the fact that I think this was alluded to, but just to double click and underline. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Just to double click on the fact that was sort of alluded to earlier, is that we recognize that up to 75% of the Indian workforce, or roughly translated into 380 million, depend on heat exposed labor and at times are working under potentially life-threatening temperatures. And this percentage of people are actually leading to nearly half of the country's GDP, according to the World Bank report on climate investment and opportunities. But what does this translate into in the everyday of the informal, unorganized worker? There needs to be an acknowledgement of the fact that cities are currently not being built or livable for these informal workers and unorganized workers. They're being built on the concrete and sweat of the unorganized workers, but both those facts are currently ignored. We're also not acknowledging that the informal settlements where these unorganized workers live are high material and residentially very dense areas, which are also heat trapping in a sense. But in that way, in the same way, there is also currently momentum being built because of clarion calls made by the central government and specific state governments around the fact that there is a need for carbon emission reduction, and there is a push being made for credible climate action programs to roll out. But the fact is, where are the vulnerable people and unorganized sector in this climate action planning and in these programs that are being made up? And towards that, our strategies of engagement have really been on convening people and organizations to be able to put these demands forward. and doing that by getting the unorganized sector to build their own information levels, awareness, and capacities to build organic champions from within the community to set their own demands. How do we do this? We use this to the tools of culture and narrative. The culture is essential. The culture tools that we use are storytelling and um, folk art and dance and music from within the community to humanize these very jargon and scientifically heavy concepts for the communities themselves, and also to draw on their local identities to make solutions more tangible. We know that there is a need for more evidence and impact of climate change on migration, health, and wages to surface for the vulnerable and unorganized sector to be able to set these demands. So one of the ways at Purpose that we have been doing it is co-creating and um, getting the user to generate data that is relevant and reflective of their needs. Another way is another gap that Purpose has identified in our work that we've been doing specifically in the BRICS sector is that the city action plans that are currently dependent are not responsive to workers and don't really have set allocations for them. There is also an issue around um, that climate policies and climate change policies sit under the Ministry of Environment, MOEFCC, but the labor policies and labor departments sit under 7 or 8 different the labor work that happens under 7 or 8 different departments, and there is very little interlinkage in that happening. So there needs to be more work done around creating those interlinkages. And some of the crucial steps in order to create those interlinkages is also what we internally identify as inclusive decision making that allows for more transparency and ownership of decision making when the vulnerable and impacted audiences are engaged and taken along on the decision making journey. And also from the perspective of decision making being a deliberative process, where some examples of the work we've done specifically are citizen juries, where specifically in Chhattisgarh, during COVID, one of our partner networks, such as Socrates, was actually putting citizen panels together and speaking about how the migration affected unorganized workers in Chhattisgarh and what were the results of that, and presenting that to respective departments and bodies that then took cognizance of it. So while this was specifically around what governmental action should look at, from a civil society and ecosystems perspective, there are a lot of perceptions that hinder ecosystem action. For instance, with our work with Brickin, what we found was that there was an immense environment of mistrust and animosity among stakeholders themselves, where Brickin owners were deeply distrustful of regulatory authorities and pollution control boards. And
2 minutes to just kindly wrap up. Okay.
of course. And the fact is that we need to be able to speak to not in the voice of the informal worker, but pass the mic to them and be able to speak to them and deliver more narrative that allows for them to be able to be the center of the conversation. Just to specifically talk about certain narratives that we think need to be highlighted when we are talking about the unorganized sector is that while there is an attention being paid to the health impacts, and there is more consequential reporting taking place, there is a need to also talk about loss of productivity and opportunity costs specifically in these hazardous environments, and have more data around that from the workers perspective. And also, while we recognize that there has been a narrative shift over the last decade about the intensity of impact, the scale of the issue from the workers' perspective still hasn't been captured. So I'll pause here and be able to respond to any questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Joshi, for this very informative and incisive presentation on the issues about the unorganized sector and particularly the need to communicate effectively. So our next speaker is Dr. Kiran Sombanshi, and she will be speaking about innovation and technological change. So Dr. Sombanshi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Ghosh. Thank you, CUTS International. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. So we had discussion by Mr. Ghosh and the earlier two speakers. I think a lot has been highlighted about the issues. I think per se issues are known about the unorganized workforce. Let me highlight the innovations that can be brought in to kind of ease the way the conditions of working are for these unorganized sector. So and because now compared to earlier years, there is frugal innovation happening. There are options available at a much cheaper rate compared to earlier times to actually ease the working conditions. The examples could be, when we are talking about climate change, one of the major important aspects would be information, dissemination of information in terms of early warning systems. How can you have systems where you are kind of warning and helping the workers to not be exposed to the extremities of the climate? So in the last few days we have seen a lot of flash floods happening in different places. The question would be that can warning systems be enabled enough for people who are out there working to let them know about heat waves or flash floods or extreme rainfall? I think that if companies can enable the workers to know, I think that information itself can be a huge help for people who are actually working there and exposed to the elements. So other thing would be, and would require some bit of investments, which many companies today are ready to kind of put in, is wearable tech and climate resistant clothing. So how do you kind of help them to actually physically be capable of warding off climate change? So how can you have can you have watches being given to workers who are to see if their health parameters being monitored? If, and again, for many of them it will sound like we are not that developed as a country, how many companies are actually doing it? So obviously we will see that from the large companies first, the multinational companies or the large companies who are actually answerable to see whether their supply chain, whether their gig workers are being well treated or are being taken care of. So we will see that initially from those companies, and then we will see these technological innovations becoming more commonly seen. So for example, an earlier speakers talked about a brick kiln. So obviously we will not see people having wearable technology working in brick kilns immediately, but we will see companies slowly and steadily starting to use that, especially when wearable tech becomes cheaper. It is increasingly becoming cheaper. So can we have heat resistant clothing? Can we have a clothing which will reduce the extremities of the temperature or the climate? Then climate smart buildings, that is another option. We are talking about green buildings. How can they be better ventilated? Air conditioning increasingly is being seen as a basic amenity. It's no longer a luxury. In a country like India, with heat waves becoming common, air conditioning is simply something which is almost a basic necessity now, not only just in summers, but during more months than earlier. So I think that we will see soon happening, not immediately, but at least steadily. So that is one innovation. It's not an innovation, for most people are already using it, but for unorganized workforce, I think that also can be a big important service. Then green roofs, better shaded areas. So small things, but having that empathic step, or taking that empathic measure that okay, they are exposed to us, we are sitting in air conditioned office and they are working out there in the sun. I think simple innovations like providing shaded area, green buildings, providing wearable tech, providing better clothing, predictive analysis, using data to kind of predict better, that giving that flexibility of working hours, that, to avoid the sun, so that they can either work early morning, or, providing that renewable energy lighting, so that a lot of work can be done during the night to, reduce their exposure to the sun. Earlier, one of the speakers talked about how renewable energy can be used. And I think we see that when renewable energy, increasingly when it is being harnessed, the cost of energy is coming down, then we will see that energy also being used to cover a lot of these issues which are faced by the unorganized workers. So that is one innovation, that how can you use your cheaper energy which is being harnessed by renewable sources, and how can you use that to provide better facilities to the unorganized workers, to the gig workers. Can you give them, so those are the small, I wouldn't call them innovations, but these are the measures that companies sooner or later will have to take. One important aspect that is a shift that I have seen happening is companies no longer have these unorganized workers on their own payrolls. We have contractors increasingly looking at, and that has been the case, but increasingly more so. So that liability of taking care of the workforce, I think that has to increase. That accountability has to increase. Companies have to kind of necessarily ask these contractors to kind of provide the basic facilities. So I think accountability also has to come in. It's not an innovation, but it's a basic thing which we will see happening. Then insurance can be provided. I think a lot of these gig workers also complain that they are not insured enough. I think insurance products can be, so that's a kind of financial innovation also towards inclusion that companies can do, providing health insurance, providing basic insurance to those people who are actually on the ground getting the things done. So I think climate related insurance is the need of the hour. And technology, of course, can be harnessed in all of it. The fact that technology is, permeating, and it is increasingly becoming cheaper to kind of use digital methods, robotics, AI. A lot of heavy lifting can actually be done by robots, and which is happening in many other countries, not in India yet, but we will see that increasingly. Now, of course, increased use of technology and robotics doesn't necessarily sit well with actual employment, because higher the use of technology, it will have impact on the number of people that you are going to employ. So obviously those two are not positively correlated. But having said that, tech can be used to kind of enable the employee to the worker to actually do work better. So I think that is very important. Like earlier, and industry 4.0, we are seeing smart factories coming in. We are seeing a lot of tech being used in factories, which is increasingly making the jobs of the actual worker easier. Like I was seeing, the videos of these factories, smart factories, and a lot of heavy lifting. Earlier, people used to, even if loading of goods, earlier people used to actually put the goods on your back and then take it. Nowadays, most of this is being handled by machines, and very savvy machines, in the sense which actually do a lot of heavy lifting. But at the same time, it has also reduced the number of workers that are being used in the factories. So use of tech and AI will increase as we go along, and we see that unorganized workers, that will be a challenge. Like, to the extent that you are able to enable their employment, it's great. Otherwise, it can be a replacement for them. So use of tech is a very dicey thing. It is a double-edged sword, because tech can also kind of do away with the need of the worker altogether. So there are instances of that too also happening. So technology is great, especially for gig workers. Like now with the delivery happening through drones, we are seeing that, right? We don't know if you are going to be delivering products through drones. We may not need those workers for that particular delivery. So use of technology is good only if it is going to be enhancing the way people work, not necessarily replacing them. So, that's a tricky kind of a thing. And we are seeing that steady increase in use of technology, smart factories or this by, I'll give you an example. This is what I remember. Truck workers have been seeking this demand. They have been demanding air conditioned cabin for themselves, since some time. And there has been proposals by the government asking the auto industry to kind of get their cabins air conditioned. But over the years, the industry has kept on representing and stalling the demand. Finally, I think the latest notification from the government has been that 2026, is a year when they have to compulsorily make sure that they have trucks which are equipped with air conditioned, at least in that cabin where the driver sits. So, anything which is going to come in will have to be continuously represented, voiced out, highlighted by the civil society, by the NGOs, so the companies actually end up doing it. Because otherwise, climate change, while it is a priority or it is a pressing issue, for unorganized workers, the benefits will be, they will be the last probably to get the benefits of those steps which are taken. So I think that is something which I see as observation. I think this is what largely I have to highlight. If there are any questions or any comments, I would be happy to take it.
Yeah, thank you for this very informative presentation on the promise as well as the challenges of technology in addressing, workers in the context of climate change. So the comments and questions will be after the next speaker has had a chance. So the next speaker is Ms. Pooja Kini. She will speak on how the ESG framework can aid in the development of more equitable and resilient policies for India's unorganized workforce affected by climate change. So, Ms. Kinney, you have the floor.
Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Ghosh. Ms. Kinney couldn't join this panel today because of some urgency. So we'll have only 4 speakers and we can move to Ms. Neha.
Okay.
Sorry for the inconvenience.
Okay, that's it. So let's move to Ms. Neha. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So Neha, you have the floor. Is she there?
Ma'am, your mic is on mute.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. So I don't know whether it is Pooja's question that I can respond to, or I should add some aspects on MSMEs, etc. I mean, I'm happy to do both, but Dr. Ghosh, you can guide me. What would you like me to respond to?
Yeah, so make your presentation. So, we'll have the responses to the speakers, after your presentation.
Okay. So since we're talking about unorganized sector, I would just, as a part of climate transition, as we call it, maybe I can focus a little bit more towards the MSME sector, which is going to be absolutely instrumental to this transition, and also faces a risk of being left out in terms of, access to some services, to goods, to finance, which will make this transition happen for them. So we are talking about workers, we are talking about just, and if I just step back a little, for me, it is more a question of just transition. I mean, we tend to look at just transition only from the perspective of fossil fuel industries, or coal, or coming out of coal and getting into renewable space. But I think it is also a question of just transition when climate change risks affect certain entities which may not have the wherewithal to actually manage those risks. Why that is on the risk side of things, as well as opportunities that get created that get sort of cornered away by big companies. The capital that is needed to transition is also gets sort of crowded out. So big capital tends to crowd out small capital, big companies tend to crowd out small companies, big jobs tend to crowd out small jobs. So I think it is extremely important for us to understand, first of all, that nothing is on autopilot. When we say green, it does not necessarily mean just. And when we say just, it does not necessarily mean green. But since the topic is about the emphasis is right now on that any kind of transition that happens now has to be fundamentally green, and that impulse needs to be progressed, and there is no reverse gear on that. Then how do we make that green transition much more inclusive? And here I would like to talk a little bit more about the MSME sector. Now, climate risks, as we know, India is hotter, poorer. What is applicable to India as a country gets much more accentuated when it comes to individual firms, simply in terms of the wherewithal that we have. Do we have the wherewithal of technology? Do we have the wherewithal of resources to be able to manage those exogenous shocks? The exogenous shocks which have increased in severity, the exogenous shocks which have increased in their frequency. Now, some data shows that let me talk, and also the climate risks that are, we can classify them into broadly two categories. People have talked about extreme weather events, which is the physical part of the risk, but also immediately we have to think about the pace of change in policy that the government is bringing into, the pace of change in technology, the pace of change in terms of, supply chain characteristics when they are globally integrated. Now, if you do, I think, Saudamini, you were talking about the damage or the impact of climate change risk, but just giving certain numbers, and I was reading about it. In 2023, Tamil Nadu cyclone, there was this district which faced the cyclone. 4,800 SMEs got impacted across 24 industrial estates, and the amount of loss that they had to bear was nearly $360 million. Okay. In Gujarat in 2023, heavy rainfall caused disruption in just the logistical supply chain, and 60 million USD was lost. So on account of not only extreme weather, whether that's flood or whether it's drought, there's disruption to the basic business continuity. But look at, somebody was talking about the heat stress, okay? Heat stress just gives you another level of health risk, or forces another level of health risk, of which the exact data is also not available to us. But from what we know is that India alone accounts for 34 million job losses pertaining to heat stress out of the total 80 million job losses related to heat stress globally. Now imagine the exposure that we have. And because a large part of our workforce is informal, or is contractual labor, or is an MSME thing, MSME sector, it is just a tremendous amount of challenge for us to transition, okay, in an orderly fashion, in a fashion that is also people positive or people centric. Now, this is the side of the physical impact of climate change. This is the type of risk that MSMEs and their workers will be subjected to. And we were talking about their equipment, we were talking about their clothing. I mean, if you really look at, forget about MSMEs. I do not know how many of us actually wear climate change proof clothing, right? So there is also not only a lack of awareness, but also what our workers are used to doing, and how can you make that mindset change happen. The other part is transition. When transition happens in policies, then what happens? So there will, Dr. Ghosh, you said there will be job losses. Absolutely, there will be job losses. But how fast will we be able to reskill workforce? For example, automobile sector. Now, right now, the OEMs and the supply chain is full of unskilled labor in the automobile sector also, the spare parts, etc. But the moment it is EV, the moment it is electrified, you need new skills. You need a much more formalized labor. So there is a whole lot of challenges that within sector after sector that we will face. You take agriculture, you talk about shifting to the more sustainable practices of agriculture. Who will train them? Where will the training cost come from? So there will also be a cost implication, which goes in the public side of things, as well as, when and public money cannot alone do the whole trick. So how do you actually attract private finance to be able to really get them ready with the wherewithal to navigate this risk, and then going from risk actually towards the opportunity? Is there something uh, in this climate change and climate impact space that actually leads to more opportunity? And yes, you yourself mentioned about green jobs, but this is not on autopilot. Suddenly our economy will not start creating green jobs, which are also not only higher in number but also better in quality. So a lot of effort has to be taken at a systemic level. A lot of data needs to be generated on what kind of jobs will be required. It's a question of planning. Sanchita, your hand is raised. Okay.
Yeah, so we'll come
Sorry,
to the
sorry, that
questions
was a mistake.
after presentation.
Yeah. So I will just conclude by adding a couple of comments over here. Oh, so adapting to tomorrow, which is the title of this talk, makes me think, will green jobs, which will be focused on green technologies, which lead us to emission reduction, do we call that as an opportunity to make MSME sector resilient? Resilience itself is also not only against, it also, defined in a way that it is also against climate shocks. I think both are intricately linked when it comes to the MSME sector. Only if they are resilient, only if they can actually confront the shocks of extreme weather events, can they actually invest in low emission kind of technologies. But it will require a lot of support. Now, I will make 3 points over here. Where will those opportunities be? I think the opportunities would be in the agriculture sector. The opportunities will be in decentralized energy systems. And all of these sectors or subsectors, if you would notice in the last 5 or 6 years, the kind of conversation we needed to have or were having earlier, that has sort of fizzled out. So we need to give much more attention to decentralized local economic development, which is green, where MSME sectors can actually participate. That leads to resilience of the local economy. The second aspect is, so for example, you talk about rooftop solar. It's an important subsector where there is a lot of push, and there is, business models are now becoming familiar to people who want to finance this, but they can create a new kind of job opportunity. But for that, new skills be required. How do you, after installation, provide the servicing segment for these rooftop solar systems, so that when something goes wrong, there is not only a person who can come and fix it, not jugaad, but actually has a certificate to be able to do that, which means that you actually need to create some kind of ecosystem of skilling and actually certifying those skills that they can be credibly relied upon. The other thing that I would just like to quickly mention is that the barriers that you will see over here is mostly related to the lack of awareness and knowledge about where these opportunities lie. It is sort of lack of capacities. What I have seen when I was working with MSMEs, that once you start to handhold them, they actually really respond very, very quickly. So the business model turnaround in a small company is quicker than in a large setup. So the opportunity is there. And I think if there are banks, especially development finance institutions like SIDBI, who can come into play. So there needs to be institutional mechanism of delivering some kind of technical assistance, some kind of finance, so that climate change is not only something that you so that you become actually equipped to deal with climate change, both in terms of the challenges as well as opportunities. There's a lot going on. I think where we should be headed is joining those dots, what are the policy mechanisms that are more climate responsive, environmentally sustainable, but really put jobs, creation of jobs, access to services at the center. I'll just pause over here and I'll come back again to any questions that people may have.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Neha Kumar. I mean, this has been a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation on the challenges and opportunities for the MSME sector. So now the floor is open for comments and questions. And I see that Mihir Shekhar Bhosle raised his hand. So, Mr. Bhosle, you have the floor.
Yeah, hello all. It was an enlightening session. My question was whether ESG, environmental social governance, which has increasingly become the buzzword now in the corporate sector, how can that play a role in adapting to climate change, and whether uh, that concept has any resonance with the issue which we are discussing, the very relevant issue which we are discussing today. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, that's a very interesting question. Actually, Pooja Kini was supposed to be speaking on this theme, but she's not here. So, among the speakers who would like to take this forward, I see Dr. Sombanshi. Would you like
Yeah.
to take this question? Yeah.
Yeah. So, one of the important aspects of ESG is the reporting, the disclosures, and when we talk about from the unorganized or the MSME segment, companies have to also nowadays start disclosing from next year the scope 3 of their uh, activities. So, scope 3 is basically when you talk about your supply chain, when you're talking about all the smaller companies which are supplying to you or doing business with you. So large companies have to start talking about what they are doing, how good are these MSMEs per se in upholding the ESG part. So here comes an important thing. So MSMEs in a way are being, for many large companies, they are actually hand-holding these MSMEs in upping their ESG. So how do you, report better? How do you make yourself more accountable? How do you maintain EHS in your factories or in your labor units? So I think that is an important aspect which we will see going ahead, that larger companies actually doing capacity building through their supply chain. So to all the smaller units that are supplying to the larger companies. So I think that aspect of ESG is an important aspect to note, that when we talk about ESG, it's not just large companies, it's also large companies being held accountable to report what their smaller supply chain partners are doing. And in that way, since they don't want to appear not to be doing anything, they actually handhold them a lot. And in that process, we see smaller ones also kind of upping their game.
Thank you, Dr. Sombanshi. Who would like to go next?
Can I just add something to it, Dr. Ghosh?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. So, you know what Kiran just mentioned, I think that is definitely an emerging reality. More and more of this is happening. But at the same time, because of regulatory pressures for companies to be clean, it can also be the case that companies push the dirty activities down the tail of the supply chain. That is also happening, because the regulations are actually right now limited to the large cap companies, listed companies. So those who are reporting, these are people, these are large players in the ecosystem. They have to report on their value chain, but also to be clean themselves. There is a tendency also to push the dirty activities, and also an idea that they will not engage with some of those suppliers which are important but are carrying out the activities in a non-ESG compliant manner. But I think the issue is that of engagement. If you have engagement over ESG, the win-win or the aggregate improvement that happens in the lead firm as well as the supply chain is much more it is much more sustainable for the overall ESG performance. The second thing is that SEBI has now come out, or is going to come out, with something called MSME Lite. So they have a reporting framework for large companies. They will be doing a lighter version for SMEs. Now, what does light mean? Light does not necessarily mean that you will be less green. Light should mean that it will reduce the process intensiveness of reporting, right? So I don't think there can be a dilution in the benchmark of E, S, and G. It can be made more adoptable to MSMEs who don't have large systems by reducing the requirement of the processes that involved in the reporting process or internal audit or external audit. So I just wanted to add a couple of points like this over here.
Thank you. So we have a question from Vidisha Sadhu. She says that to Sodmini, I have a question that in light of climate change, what are the main obstacles to providing social protection to unprotected workers? And how may these obstacles be overcome to graduate fair treatment for this vulnerable segment of workers? Now, I think this was largely covered in some of the presentation, but anyway, would somebody like to take this up in addition to what has already been said?
I can briefly respond to the question if it's okay, Dr. Ghosh.
Yeah.
So, Bidisha, I think the first thing is awareness generation, and that awareness generation has to happen with the informal workers in a way that allows them to build agency to be able to build demand. So there are two parts to this. Number one is providing information and collectivizing them, and then strengthening platforms that exist where they can make demands, whether those are government platforms, community platforms, or platforms that are being created by they themselves. So on the curve of commitment or movement, vulnerable workers or unorganized workers first have to be first their awareness and awareness levels and information levels have to be increased. Then they have to be engaged. Then they have to be mobilized in order to be able to create systems-based change for them.
Okay, thank you. Now, Samaranjay Singh raised his hand. So, Samaranjay, you have the floor.
You can unmute yourself.
He's not here, but he just raised his hand.
Yeah, he is here. I can see him.
He just okay. So
Yeah,
again,
sorry, I wasn't able to unmute.
yeah, okay, go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. My question is for Mr. A.B. Chakravarti ji. You stated an example of a company called Tamil Plates. So in those lines, how do you think can e-commerce platforms benefit marginalized artisans and like small businesses owners without leading to exploitation of monopolies or other large companies?
Yeah, thanks, sir. So I'll try to answer it in maybe two parts. So one, I think I think let's look at it from the artisan centricity first. Based on our experience and the investments and what is happening in the space, largely artisans, especially in India, the occupation was dwindling because there was a lack of design connect to, let's say, national and international audience, because these were traditional designs that were only available. The second biggest challenge was, connecting to the market. I may produce something which may be contemporary or to the liking of the consumers, but how do you get the correct price for it? It can be a silk saree, or it could be a good weave from, any of those artisanal clusters, but lack of market connect, right? Which means that physical infrastructure is not there, consumer connect is not there, technology is not there. So now these are fundamental things that are currently still happening in the artisan space. So that's what we are looking at to say that, how do you turn around this using e-commerce as a platform, or companies which are in early stage investing can help crack it, which is in an unexploited way. I think that's the word you used. I think more than exploitation, I would say, how do you get the right remuneration and right the bidding for them, right? So one, obviously bringing design close to them, let's say from the global market, from the national market. how do you use technology to inform the design? Today, WhatsApp is being used by just not a lot of SMEs, actually even SMEs to communicate with the job holders, even in our own portfolio. So that's another classical example. How do you maybe sitting miles away, but you are able to translate the design and help create that process. By using the same means, how do you bring those products that are manufactured into the market and pay the right price? There is a company that we have invested in which very specifically the consumer, whatever price that they are quoting for the product, it is shown to the artisan who is maybe miles away, right? So then it gives a understanding that, okay, what is it my consumer is willing to pay, and that is what I am sort of willing to sell. So here the empowerment lies in the power lies in the hands of the artisans to make, whether I am willing to sell the product at the price that is mentioned. So when you create marketplaces like this, and that is when truly the transformation can happen through this model in a much empowered way.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chakravarti. And I don't see any more hands. So any of the panelists would like to add to his or her earlier comments?
I think I have got a question saying that how can the ESG frameworks integration of environmental and social aspects aid in the development of more equitable and resilient policies for India's vulnerable communities and unorganized workforce? Just to answer that is, so you're asking the how. So I will give you an example. Companies have to report on whether they have any casualties in their factories, whether there has been any impact on the proximate communities or anyone basically due to their operations. So increasingly, any casualties or any bad effects of climate change will directly or indirectly start getting mapped in the company's ESG disclosure framework. So I think as more and more of this starts happening, now there's not going to be an immediate overnight impact, but slowly and steadily companies would want to kind of see to it that they become accountable for all of them, under all the workers under them. So of course, part of the one of the solutions companies do is to kind of outsource this operation, or as one of the speakers mentioned, that they kind of push it to the supply chain, the dirty work. But even when scope 3 emission will have to be accounted for, then companies will also have to talk about what is happening at the supply chain end. And this is just one example of talking about casualties, or has anyone got impacted because of the company's business. So that is how it will slowly and steadily start getting counted. So it's like awareness is the first step towards change. So first, companies will have to be kind of shown that, okay, they need to be made aware about who all is getting impacted for them to make any change. So that's the answer.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sumbanshi. And we have time for just one more comment or question. So is there any participant who would like to have the final say? So if none, then I would like to give the floor back to Tasmita. Tasmita, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. So as we draw this insightful and stimulating webinar to a close, it is my great honor to deliver the vote of thanks. Today's discussions have been both enlightening and inspiring, exploring the impact of climate change on India's informal workforce and MSME sector, and discussing the strategies to enhance their resilience and job security. First and foremost, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed panelists. And I would also like to thank our audience for their active participation as well as engagement. The questions and comments which were posed have enriched the dialogue and underscored the collective commitment towards adapting to the challenge of climate change and moving towards net zero emissions with respect to India's informal sector MSMEs and also addressing ESG. Finally, as we leave today's session, let's carry forward the momentum and collaborative spirit that we have gathered. The path towards achieving a sustainable future is challenging, but with this collective effort of the private sector, policymakers, and the global community as a whole, we can overcome all these challenges, or at least try overcoming some, and create a resilient and sustainable world. Thank you for everybody's participation, and we will also have another webinar next month, and we hope to have you all again and for future further engagements.
Okay.
Over to you, Sanchita ma'am, if you have any further.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you, Dr. Ghosh. We'll come up with a summary of today's discussion, and that will be uploaded on our website.
And
So
we'll
thank you.
also share it the same with our speakers as well. Yeah.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.